6 months after the incident that changed everything, Jake walked into his new classroom to find 43 alien cadets waiting for him. Unlike his first class, these students sat quietly with notebooks ready and expressions of serious attention. Word of what had happened to Veltar had spread throughout the Galactic Federation, and suddenly everyone wanted to understand how Deathworlders really fought. The new training protocols that Jake had helped develop were now standard throughout Federation space. Warning signs in multiple languages marked rooms where humans were training. Medical teams stood by during all mixed-species exercises. Most importantly, Jake's lessons now began with mandatory viewing of Veltar's testimony about the incident. Class. Before we begin today's session on defensive reflexes, we will watch the testimony that all new students must see, Jake announced. The holographic display activated to show Veltar sitting in a hospital chair with his face partially reconstructed and his damaged arm in a support device. The Volari spoke slowly through a translation system that converted his thoughts to audible words since his vocal apparatus had been too damaged to repair completely. "My name is Veltar of the Volari hegemony," the recording began. "I am speaking to you as someone who learned about Deathworld reflexes in the most painful way possible. When Instructor Martinez warned our class about human defensive responses, I dismissed his warnings as primitive exaggeration. I believed that superior technique and advanced civilization could overcome any crude physical reaction." The recorded Veltar paused as memories of pain flickered across his reconstructed features. "I was wrong. When I grabbed Instructor Martinez's hair during what I thought was a controlled demonstration, I triggered reflexes that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution on one of the galaxy's most dangerous worlds. The result was injuries that will affect me for the rest of my life." Jake watched his current students as they absorbed Veltar's words. Unlike his first class, these aliens understood that they were not listening to theoretical discussions about alien biology. They were learning from someone who had experienced the reality of human capabilities firsthand. "But I do not speak to you today to seek sympathy or to condemn humans as dangerous," Veltar's testimony continued. "I speak to you because my mistake taught me something valuable about the nature of survival and adaptation. Humans are not violent by choice. They are survivors by necessity. Their reflexes exist because anything less than perfect defensive responses meant death on their homeworld." The recording ended and Jake faced his attentive students. "Questions about Veltar's testimony before we begin practical demonstrations?" A young Cathara raised one of her 4 arms. "Instructor Martinez, how do we train alongside humans without triggering these dangerous reflexes?" "Excellent question, Cadet Jek. The answer is that you learn to work with human reflexes instead of against them. You learn to move and communicate in ways that our subconscious minds interpret as friendly rather than threatening." Jake gestured to a Zorathi student in the front row. "Cadet Brack, approach me as if you want to get my attention during a combat scenario." The furry alien stood and walked toward Jake with careful, deliberate steps, keeping his hands visible and making soft vocalizations that Jake's ears interpreted as non-threatening. When Brack reached out to touch Jake's shoulder, he did so slowly, and from the side where Jake could see him coming. "Perfect," Jake said. "Cadet Brack has learned to approach a human in a way that does not trigger defensive responses." He moved slowly, stayed visible, made calming sounds, and touched me in a location that does not threaten vital areas. My reflexes classify him as an ally, not a threat. A Volari student raised her crystalline hand. "But what if we need to restrain? A human ally who has been injured or compromised? Surely there must be safe ways to apply physical control? Jake nodded. There are, but they require understanding human anatomy and psychology. Dr. Parker, would you like to explain the safe contact protocols? Dr. Lisa Parker stepped forward from where she had been observing the class. Her presence was now a standard part of all human combat training. The key is to avoid triggering the specific neural pathways that activate defensive reflexes. Contact points on the extremities, gentle pressure rather than sudden grabbing, and constant verbal communication to keep the conscious mind engaged. She demonstrated on Jake, showing how to guide a human's movement through pressure on the forearms and shoulders, while talking constantly to maintain mental connection. The moment you grab hair, throat, or any area near the head and spine, you risk triggering responses that can seriously injure you. The practical portion of the class proceeded, with careful attention to the new safety protocols. Jake demonstrated human reflexes using practice dummies that had been designed to simulate threatening contact without actually triggering his responses. The students took detailed notes on everything from safe approach angles to emergency procedures. If human reflexes did activate, halfway through the session, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Jake's communication device crackled to life with an emergency message from Admiral Kexthor. All military personnel report to combat stations immediately. We have hostile ships approaching the system. This is not a drill. Jake looked at his students who were already gathering their equipment with practiced efficiency. 6 months of training with Deathworld combat techniques had changed them from curious academics to serious warriors who understood the reality of violence. Class dismissed, Jake announced. Report to your assigned combat stations and remember what you have learned about working with human allies. The response to the pirate attack that followed became a case study in successful human-alien cooperation. Jake found himself assigned to a mixed-species boarding party, tasked with retaking a Federation transport ship that had been captured by raiders. His team included Cadet Jek, the Cathara, who had asked about triggering human reflexes, and Cadet Brack, the Zorathi, who had demonstrated proper approach techniques. Unlike the terrified aliens who had backed away from him after the incident with Veltar, these students moved confidently alongside him as they prepared for real combat. When the shooting started, Jake's reflexes kicked in exactly as they had been designed to do. But this time, instead of causing confusion and fear among his allies, the aliens knew what to expect. They stayed out of his immediate combat zone while providing covering fire and tactical support. When Jake's enhanced reflexes identified and eliminated threats with devastating efficiency, his teammates were ready to move in and secure the area. Cadet Jek later described the experience in her after-action report. Working with Instructor Martinez in real combat was like fighting alongside a natural disaster that happened to be on our side. His responses were so fast and decisive that the pirates had no time to react. But because we understood how his reflexes worked, we could coordinate our actions to support him rather than getting in his way. The successful mission marked a turning point in how the galaxy viewed human soldiers. Instead of seeing them as dangerous and unpredictable, military, planners began to understand how Deathworld reflexes could be incorporated into Federation tactics. Human soldiers became highly sought after for boarding actions and close-quarters combat, where their automated responses gave them overwhelming advantages. Jake's classroom became a pilgrimage site for alien officers who wanted to understand how to work with human troops. The lessons learned from Veltar's painful experience had transformed from a cautionary tale into a blueprint for successful integration. On the anniversary of the incident, Veltar visited Jake's class to speak with the new students. The Valari had learned to walk again despite his injuries and had become an advocate for understanding between species rather than retreating into fear and isolation. Instructor Martinez did not attack me out of malice or anger, Veltar told the attentive cadets. He reacted exactly as millions of years of evolution had programmed him to react. The fault was mine for not listening when he tried to warn me about the nature of that programming. The lesson you must learn is not to fear humans, but to understand them. They are the survivors of a world that tried to kill them every day. That makes them valuable allies and terrifying enemies. Jake watched from the back of the classroom as Veltar spoke. The Valari's injuries were permanent reminders of that terrible day when Jake's reflexes had broken an alien who had simply not understood what he was dealing with. But those injuries had also become the foundation for a new kind of cooperation between species that had never learned to fight together before. The galaxy is becoming a more dangerous place, Veltar concluded his speech. Pirates and raiders are growing bolder, while unknown threats emerge from beyond our borders. We need allies who can respond to violence with overwhelming force when diplomacy fails. Humans are those allies, but only if we learn to work with them instead of against them. As the students filed out of the classroom, Jake approached Veltar with mixed emotions. The alien had forgiven him for the injuries, but Jake still carried guilt about that day when his reflexes had nearly killed someone who was only trying to learn. "Thank you for continuing to speak to my classes," Jake said. The investigation began immediately after Veltar was stabilized in the medical bay. Admiral Kexthor, a battle-scarred Zorathi who commanded the military academy, had seen enough real combat to understand that accidents happened in training. But he had never seen anything like the devastating injuries that resulted from what should have been a simple demonstration. Jake sat in a sterile conference room answering the same questions over and over again. A panel of officers from different species took turns asking him to describe exactly what had happened and why. The security recordings showed everything clearly, but the investigators seemed unable to understand how such minimal contact had resulted in such severe damage. "Lieutenant Martinez," said Commander Theiss, a Cathera whose compound eyes never seemed to blink, "our analysis of the footage shows that Cadet Veltar's grip on your hair lasted approximately 2.3 seconds. Your response began almost immediately. How do you explain such rapid escalation?" Jake rubbed his temples where a headache was building. He had been in this room for 6 hours, trying to explain human reflexes to aliens who had no equivalent responses in their own biology. "Commander, I have tried to explain this multiple times. When someone grabs my hair and yanks on it, my body does not wait for conscious permission to respond. The reflexes activate automatically." "But surely you have some control over the intensity of your response," pressed Dr. Yenth, a Valari medical officer whose crystalline features reminded Jake uncomfortably of Veltar. "Our species has learned to modulate our reactions through centuries of civilization." "Your species evolved on a world where modulating reactions was safe," Jake replied. "On Earth, taking time to think about your response usually means you are dead. Our reflexes are designed to eliminate threats as quickly and completely as possible." Admiral Kexthor leaned forward with interest. Unlike the other investigators, the old Zorathi seemed to grasp the implications of what Jake was saying. "Are you telling us that all humans possess these kinds of reflexes? That any human could cause similar injuries under the right circumstances?" "Yes, sir," Jake said, "though the specific responses vary from person to person based on training and experience. Some humans have learned to suppress their reflexes better than others, but the underlying systems are present in all of us." The room fell silent as the investigators absorbed this information. Jake could see them trying to understand what it meant to have an entire species with built-in weapon systems that could activate without conscious control. The concept was completely foreign to their experience. Dr. Lisa Parker entered the conference room carrying a data tablet and several files. The human xenobiologist had been brought in to provide expert testimony about human physiology and psychology. Her arrival seemed to make the alien investigators more nervous rather than less. "Dr. Parker," Admiral Kexthor said, "perhaps you can help us understand the biological mechanisms behind what happened to Cadet Veltar." Dr. Parker activated a holographic display that showed cross-sections of human and alien anatomy. The key difference is in how our nervous systems evolved to handle threats. Most Federation species developed complex brains that could override instinctual responses. Humans developed reflexes that bypassed the brain entirely. She highlighted specific neural pathways on the display. When someone grabs a human's hair and pulls backward, sensory neurons send signals directly to the spinal cord. Motor neurons activate muscles before the information even reaches the brain. The entire response can happen in less than 100 milliseconds. Commander Thiss clicked in what Jake had learned was the Kithara equivalent of disbelief. 100 milliseconds? That is faster than conscious thought. Exactly, Dr. Parker said. By the time a human brain processes what is happening, the reflexive response is already underway. Lieutenant Martinez could not have stopped his reaction even if he had wanted to. Dr. Yenth studied the anatomical displays with obvious concern. "Dr. Parker, what other stimuli might trigger similar responses in humans? We need to understand the full scope of potential dangers." Dr. Parker switched to a new display showing various threat scenarios. Sudden loud noises, rapid movement toward the face, pressure on the throat, being grabbed from behind, impacts to the head or spine. Essentially, any stimulus that human evolution interpreted as potentially lethal. That covers a significant portion of normal social interaction, Admiral Kexthor observed grimly. How do humans function in civilized society with such hair-trigger responses? We learn to suppress them through training and social conditioning, Dr. Parker explained. But the suppression is never complete. Under stress or in unfamiliar situations, the reflexes can break through. What happened with Cadet Veltar was actually a fairly mild response compared to what humans are capable of. The investigators exchanged glances that Jake could not interpret. He had a sinking feeling that this revelation was making things worse rather than better. The aliens were beginning to understand that humans were far more dangerous than they had initially believed. There is another factor we need to consider, Dr. Parker continued. Lieutenant Martinez showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances. His reflexes identified Cadet Veltar as a threat and responded accordingly, but he regained conscious control within seconds. An untrained human might have continued the assault until the perceived threat was completely eliminated. Jake winced at the clinical description of what had happened. Dr. Parker was right that he had stopped himself quickly, but that was small comfort when Veltar was lying in the medical bay with injuries that would change his life forever. The investigation continued for 3 more days. Jake was suspended from teaching duties while the panel reviewed testimony and analyzed the security footage frame by frame. Medical reports on Veltar's condition were grim. The Valari had survived the surgery, but his face would never look the same and his damaged hand would never regain full function. When the panel finally reached their conclusions, Admiral Kexthor delivered the verdict personally. Lieutenant Martinez, this investigation has determined that you acted within the parameters of your species' biological limitations. However, the incident has revealed fundamental incompatibilities between Deathworld reflexes and standard Federation training protocols. Jake felt relief and dread in equal measure. He was not going to be court-martialed, but the way the Admiral spoke suggested that his career in integrated training was over. The recommendation of this panel, Admiral Kexthor continued, is that all future training involving Deathworld species be conducted under modified protocols with enhanced safety measures. You will be reassigned to develop these new protocols based on your experience and expertise. As Jake left the conference room, he passed a group of alien cadets in the corridor. They pressed themselves against the walls when they saw him coming, their eyes wide with fear. Word of what had happened had spread throughout the station. The other aliens now saw him not as an instructor, but as a dangerous predator who could explode into violence without warning. The irony was not lost on Jake. He had spent weeks trying to teach them about human capabilities, and they had dismissed his warnings as exaggeration. Now they believed him completely, but their fear would make future training almost impossible. In the medical bay, Jake stopped to check on Veltar. The Valari was conscious but heavily sedated. Bandages covered most of his face, and his right arm was immobilized in a medical device that was slowly rebuilding his shattered bones. "I am sorry," Jake said quietly. Veltar's remaining functional. I focused on him with surprising clarity. When he spoke, his voice was distorted by the damage to his face, but the words were clear enough. "Do not apologize, Instructor Martinez. You warned us what would happen. We chose not to listen. Perhaps now my people will understand that there are some lessons that can only be learned through pain." Jake stood in the center of the training mat, feeling like he was about to make a terrible mistake. Every instinct he had developed over years of combat training was telling him to walk away from this demonstration. But the alien cadets were watching, him with expectant faces, and he could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought he was exaggerating about human reflexes because they had never seen them in action. "Remember," Jake said, looking directly at Veltar, "this is just a demonstration. Grab my hair firmly, but do not yank or twist. The moment I say stop, you let go immediately." Veltar nodded with the casual confidence of someone who had never been in a real fight. His crystalline features caught the light as he moved closer to Jake. The other aliens formed a loose circle around them, all eager to see what would happen when their advanced techniques met primitive human responses. "I understand the safety protocols," Veltar said. "I will apply just enough force to demonstrate the control technique without causing harm." Jake forced himself to relax and tried to quiet the warning voices in his head. This was supposed to be a learning exercise, not a real combat situation. He could keep his reflexes under control for a simple demonstration. He had done it before in training scenarios back on Earth. The problem was that those training scenarios had been with other humans who understood how to move and grab in ways that did not trigger defensive responses. Veltar moved like a dancer, all flowing grace and elegant precision. To human reflexes, that kind of smooth, controlled movement looked exactly like a predator stalking its prey. "Whenever you are ready," Jake said. Veltar stepped behind Jake and reached for his hair with long, delicate fingers. The Valari's touch was gentle at first, almost careful. Jake felt the alien's fingers threading through his hair and forced himself to remain still. This was fine. This was controlled. Nothing bad was going to happen. Then Veltar decided to demonstrate proper technique. The Valari's grip tightened, and he pulled backward with sudden force, trying to show the other cadets how hair could be used to control an opponent's head movement. To Veltar, it was just a training exercise. To Jake's reflexes, it was a predator attack. The response was immediate and devastating. Jake's body moved before his conscious mind even registered what was happening. His head snapped forward in a vicious headbutt that caught Veltar square in the face. The sound of crystalline bone structure shattering echoed through the training room like breaking glass. At the same time, Jake's hands shot up and grabbed Veltar's extended arm. His fingers clamped down with crushing force as every muscle in his body engaged at maximum power. The delicate Volari bones, evolved for a low-gravity world where violence was unknown, simply could not withstand the pressure. Veltar's scream was a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard. It started as a musical tone like the alien's normal voice, but quickly became something raw and animal as pain overwhelmed his elegant speech patterns. The scream cut off abruptly as shock set in, and Veltar's body went limp. Jake's reflexes were still in full control. His grip continued to tighten as his hindbrain identified the alien as a threat that needed to be eliminated. He could feel bones cracking under his fingers as his human strength, evolved to handle Earth's crushing gravity and violent predators, destroyed the fragile alien appendage. "Stop! Stop! Let him go!" The shouts from the other cadets finally penetrated the red haze that had descended over Jake's vision. His conscious mind reasserted control, and he released Veltar's mangled arm. The Volari collapsed to the floor in a spreading pool of pale blue blood that looked almost silver under the training room lights. Jake stepped back in horror as he realized what he had done. Veltar's face was a ruin of shattered crystal and torn flesh. His arm hung at an impossible angle with white bone fragments poking through translucent skin. The alien's breathing was shallow and rapid as his body fought shock and blood loss. Medical. "Emergency in Training Room 7, one of the Cathara was saying into a communication device. "We need immediate assistance for severe trauma injuries." The Zorathi cadets had backed against the walls with their fur standing on end and their large ears pressed flat against their heads. The remaining Cathara were chittering in their native language with rapid clicks that sounded like panic. Everyone was staring at Jake like he had just transformed into a monster before their eyes. "I tried to warn you," Jake said quietly, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The medical team arrived within minutes, a mix of species trained in emergency care for the various aliens on the station. They took one look at Veltar and immediately began preparing him for emergency surgery. Jake could hear them discussing the extent of the injuries in medical terminology that sounded grim in any language. Crushed metacarpals, shattered facial, sensory array, possible traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact. One of the medics was saying as they loaded Veltar onto a floating stretcher. Station security arrived next, led by a stern-looking Zorathi officer with silver fur and scars. That suggested real combat experience. Unlike the cadets, this one did not look at Jake with fear or confusion. He looked at Jake like he was examining a dangerous weapon that had just gone off unexpectedly. "Lieutenant Martinez," the security chief said in accented but clear human standard. "I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning about this incident." Jake nodded and followed the security team out of the training room. As they walked through the corridors, he could feel the stares of other station personnel. Word was already spreading about what had happened. The human instructor had nearly killed a cadet in what was supposed to be a simple training exercise. In the security office, Jake sat across from the Zorathi chief and tried to explain what had happened. The alien listened patiently as Jake described the demonstration and how his reflexes had kicked in when Veltar grabbed his hair. "So you are saying this was an involuntary response?" the chief asked. "You did not consciously decide to attack Cadet Veltar?" "That is correct," Jake replied. "When he grabbed my hair and yanked backward, my body interpreted it as an attack and responded automatically. I had no conscious control over what happened next." The security chief made notes on a device that translated his thoughts directly into text. "And how long did this involuntary response last?" Jake thought back to those terrible seconds when his reflexes had taken control. "Maybe 5 seconds. Maybe less. It felt longer, but I know it happened very fast. Fast enough to cause injuries that may permanently disable Cadet Veltar." Jake closed his eyes and tried not to think about the sound of Veltar's bones breaking, or the alien's scream of agony. "I tried to warn them. I told them that human reflexes could be dangerous. They wanted a demonstration." "Indeed," the chief said. "The security recordings confirm your account of events. However, this incident raises serious questions about the wisdom of including Deathworld species in integrated training programs." Through the office window, Jake could see the medical bay where Veltar was undergoing emergency surgery. The alien might survive, but his injuries were severe enough that he would never be the same. All because he had grabbed a human's hair during what he thought was a safe training exercise. Jake had tried to warn them, but they had not understood. How could they understand? They came from safe worlds where violence was theoretical and controlled. They had never learned that some reflexes were too dangerous to trigger even in training. Now they knew, but the lesson had come at a terrible price. 3 weeks into the training program, Jake could feel the tension building in his classroom like pressure before a storm. The alien cadets were polite and followed his instructions, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought his methods were too simple and too crude for beings as advanced as themselves. Veltar had become the unofficial spokesman for the group's concerns. The tall Valari would ask pointed questions during demonstrations that made it clear he thought human combat techniques were primitive. His crystalline features would catch the light in disapproving patterns when Jake showed them basic defensive moves. "Instructor Martinez," Veltar said during a lesson on grappling, "my people have been studying combat for over 10,000 years. We have developed techniques that use leverage and precision to overcome any opponent regardless of size or strength. These human methods seem to rely heavily on brute force." Jake finished showing the proper way to break a wrist hold and turned to face the class. "Veltar, can you show us one of these advanced techniques your people developed?" The Valari moved to the center of the mat with flowing grace. His movements looked more like a dance than preparation for combat. He demonstrated a complex series of holds and throws that involved using an opponent's momentum against them. The technique was beautiful to watch and clearly required years of practice to master. "Very impressive," Jake said when Veltar finished. "Now try it on me." Veltar hesitated for a moment. "Instructor, I would not want to accidentally injure you. These techniques are quite effective." "I appreciate the concern, but I think I can handle it. Come on." The other aliens formed a circle around them as Veltar approached Jake with careful steps. The Valari moved with confidence as he attempted to grab Jake's arm and execute the throw he had just demonstrated. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Jake. The moment Veltar's delicate fingers touched Jake's arm, Jake's body responded automatically. His muscles tensed, and his center of gravity shifted without any conscious thought. When Veltar tried to apply the leverage technique, it was like trying to throw a tree that had suddenly grown roots. Jake had not even been thinking about resisting. His body had simply recognized being grabbed by something it did not trust and had locked up defensively. Veltar pulled and twisted, trying to make his technique work, but Jake remained solid as a rock. "Interesting," Jake said. "Try again, but this time grab my wrist harder." Veltar frowned but complied. This time he gripped Jake's wrist with more force and attempted a different throw. The result was the same. Jake's human reflexes had kicked in below the level of conscious thought and made his body nearly impossible to move. "I do not understand," Veltar said, stepping back. "The technique should work regardless of the opponent's strength. The principles of leverage are universal." Jake nodded and relaxed his muscles. "You are right about leverage being universal, but you are making some assumptions about your opponent that might not be correct. Your technique works great against other Volari or similar species, but humans evolve differently." He gestured for Veltar to try again. This time, Jake forced himself to remain relaxed and let the alien throw him. The technique worked perfectly, and Jake found himself flying through the air to land on the mat with a controlled roll. "See?" Jake said, getting back to his feet. "When I let you, the technique works fine, but my reflexes do not want to let you. My body has millions of years of evolution telling it that being grabbed by a predator is bad news." One of the Kithara clicked forward. "But surely conscious control should override such primitive responses. Our species learned to suppress our instinctual behaviors when we developed civilization." Jake shook his head. "That is the difference between your worlds and mine. On your worlds, you could afford to suppress those instincts because your environments became safe. On Earth, the moment you stop listening to your survival instincts is the moment you become food for something bigger and hungrier than you." The aliens did not look convinced. Jake could see they still thought human responses were simply unrefined reactions that proper training could eliminate. They had no idea how deep those reflexes went or how fast they could activate. "Let me show you something else," Jake said. "Veltar, I want you to grab my hair and try to control my head movement." Veltar's crystalline features shifted in what Jake had learned was the Volari equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "Grab your hair? That seems like an unusual combat technique." "Exactly. It is not a good technique, which is why I want to show you what happens when someone tries it. Many species have sensitive areas on their heads that can be used for control. Hair pulling is a common way to manipulate an opponent's movement in many fighting styles." Jake turned around so the aliens could see the back of his head. His dark hair was cut short in military style, but still long enough to grab. "Human hair is actually quite strong. Each strand can support several pounds of weight, and we have over 100,000 strands on our heads. But more importantly, hair is connected to nerve endings that send pain signals to the brain." He faced the class again. "The thing is, humans have learned to deal with pain differently than most species. When something grabs our hair and yanks on it, we do not just stand there and accept the control. We react." Veltar studied Jake's hair with the analytical gaze of someone trying to understand an alien technology. "What kind of reaction should I expect?" "That depends on the situation. If you grab my hair gently, I might just pull away or ask you to stop. But if you grab it hard and try to use it to control me in what my brain interprets as a fight, then my reflexes will assume you are trying to kill me." The room fell quiet as the aliens absorbed this information. Jake could see they were trying to understand the implications of what he was saying. Most Federation species had evolved past the point where they needed violent reflexes to survive. The concept of automatic defensive responses was foreign to them. The important thing to remember, Jake continued, is that these responses happen faster than thought. When my reflexes kick in, I am not making conscious decisions about how hard to hit or where to aim. My body is just trying to eliminate a threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. One of the Zorathi raised a furry hand. Instructor Martinez, are you saying that humans cannot control these responses? That seems like it would make you dangerous. Allies. Jake smiled grimly. We can learn to control them with training and practice. But it takes years of work, and even then the reflexes are still there waiting under the surface. That is exactly why we need to train together. You need to understand how humans react so you do not accidentally trigger responses that could hurt you. Veltar stepped closer with renewed interest. Perhaps we could test this response system? A controlled demonstration would be educational for the entire class. Jake looked at the eager faces around him and felt a familiar warning sensation in his gut. These aliens had no idea what they were asking for. They thought human reflexes were just another interesting alien trait to study and catalog. They had never seen what happened when a human felt truly threatened. I do not think that is a good idea, Jake said carefully. Human defensive responses can be quite intense. Even in a controlled setting, there is risk of injury. But Veltar was already moving closer with the confidence of someone who had never encountered anything he could not handle with proper technique and superior intellect. Surely a brief demonstration would be safe enough. I am quite skilled at controlling the amount of force I apply. Jake felt his instincts starting to whisper warnings, but he pushed them down. These aliens needed to learn, and sometimes the only way to learn was through experience. He just hoped the lesson would not be too harsh when it came. Jake Martinez walked through the metal corridors of Kepler 7 station, carrying his training gear in a worn duffel bag that had seen better days back on Earth. The station buzzed with activity as beings from dozens of different worlds moved about, their daily routines. Some walked on two legs like humans, while others slithered or floated or moved in ways that still made Jake's eyes hurt when he tried to follow their motion. He had been on the station for 3 weeks now, but the sight of so many alien species still amazed him every single day. The Galactic Military Academy had chosen this massive space station as their first experiment in mixed species training. For thousands of years, different alien civilizations had trained their military forces separately on their homeworlds or specialized facilities. But now, with humanity joining the Galactic Federation, the leaders decided it was time to see if different species could learn to fight together as one united force. Jake stopped at a viewport and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth, the world the aliens called a death world. He had grown up in Colorado, where the mountains scraped the sky and the air was thin enough to make visitors from lower altitudes gasp for breath. The aliens he had met so far seemed to think that made him some kind of super soldier, but Jake knew better. He was just a regular guy who happened to grow up on a planet that tried to kill everything living on it every single day. The training facility took up an entire section of the station. Jake entered through the main doors and immediately heard the sounds of combat practice echoing from various rooms, grunts and shouts, and the clash of training weapons mixed together into a symphony of controlled violence. His assigned classroom was down the hall past rooms where other species practiced their own fighting styles. He pushed open the door to find 12 alien cadets waiting for him. Jake had studied their files, but seeing them in person still caught him off guard. The three Valari stood tall and elegant with pale blue skin that looked almost translucent. Their bones seemed to be made of some kind of crystal that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. They moved with a grace that made human dancers look clumsy by comparison. The four Kithara chittered quietly among themselves in their clicking language. Their insect-like bodies were covered in natural armor that shifted colors depending on their mood. Multiple eyes on stalks turned to track Jake's movement as he entered the room. Each of their four arms ended in hands that could manipulate objects, with precision that made human fingers look like crude tools. The five Zorathi reminded Jake most of the aliens he had expected to meet before coming to space. They looked almost like big furry bears that had learned to walk upright and wear clothes. Their thick fur ranged from brown to black to silver, and their large ears constantly twitched as they picked up sounds from all around the station. Unlike the others, they seemed more relaxed and friendly when Jake looked their way. Jake set his bag down and looked around the room. The training mats were made from some alien material that felt springy under his boots. Weapons racks lined the walls, holding practice swords and staffs and other tools he did not recognize. Large windows showed the stars beyond and gave the room a sense of openness that helped with the claustrophobic feeling of being in space. "Good morning, everyone," Jake said in the common trade language that all Federation species learned. "I am Lieutenant Jake Martinez, and I will be your close-quarters combat instructor for the next 6 months." One of the Valari stepped forward with movements that looked like a dance. This was Veltar, according to the file Jake had memorized. The alien's voice had a musical quality that made even simple words sound like poetry. "Lieutenant Martinez, we have studied your credentials, and we must express some confusion about the training protocols. Your species comes from what our scientists classify as a death world, yet you are here to teach us combat techniques. Should not a species that evolved in such harsh conditions already possess natural fighting abilities that make training unnecessary?" Jake had heard this question before from other aliens on the station. They seemed to think that growing up on Earth automatically made humans into perfect warriors. It showed how little they understood about what it really meant to be from a death world. "That is exactly why I am here to teach you," Jake replied. "Growing up on Earth does not make us natural fighters. It makes us natural survivors. There is a big difference between surviving and fighting effectively as a team." The Kithara clicked among themselves, and one spoke up. "Instructor Martinez, our analysis suggests that humans possess physical capabilities that exceed most Federation species. What purpose does structured combat training serve when you already have such advantages?" Jake smiled and shook his head. These aliens had been reading too many reports from Federation scientists who studied humans like lab specimens. They measured human strength and reflexes and bone density and came up with numbers that looked impressive on paper. But numbers could not capture the real story of what it meant to be human. "Let me ask you all a question," Jake said. "How many of you have ever been in a real fight? Not a training exercise or a sporting contest, but a real fight where you thought you might die?" The room fell silent. The aliens looked at each other with expressions Jake was learning to read, despite their very different faces. None of them raised a hand or spoke up. This was what he had expected. "I thought so," Jake continued. "Most Federation worlds are peaceful places where conflicts get resolved through talking or legal systems. Your species evolved on worlds that were safe enough to allow complex civilizations to develop without constant threats. Earth is different." He walked over to one of the windows and gestured toward the stars. On Earth, we have animals that hunt humans for food. We have weather that can kill you in minutes if you are not prepared. We have diseases and natural disasters and 1,000 other things that want to end your life. Every human alive today comes from a long line of ancestors who survived all of that. Veltar tilted his head in a way that Jake had learned meant confusion among his species. But surely such harsh conditions would make combat training even more important for your kind. Why do you need to learn techniques when your instincts should be superior? Because instincts and training are two different things, Jake explained. My instincts might keep me alive in a fight, but they will not help me work as part of a team. They will not teach me how to use weapons effectively or how to coordinate with allies who think and move differently than I do. Most importantly, they will not teach me how to hold back when I need to. The last point seemed to confuse them even more. One of the Zarathi spoke up in a voice that sounded like distant thunder. Hold back? Why would a warrior need to hold back in combat? Jake looked around the room at these aliens who had grown up on safe worlds where violence was rare and controlled. They had no idea what human reflexes were really like when they kicked in during a real fight. They thought training was about learning to hit harder and move faster. They did not understand that for humans, training was often about learning to hit softer and move more carefully. Because, Jake said quietly, sometimes the biggest challenge is not winning the fight. Sometimes the biggest challenge is making sure you do not accidentally kill your allies while you are trying to save them. The aliens exchanged glances that Jake could not interpret. He could see they did not really understand what he meant. That was fine. They would learn soon enough. The next 6 months were going to be very educational for all of them.